The
Welcome to
envelope
our
was the
beautiful
exact
farm.
color of the
I'm
icing
so
I used
excited
for
to
wedding
share our
cakes,
story with you.
and it was sitting on
It
my
has been
bakery
a
counter
long
at 5 in the
journey,
morning,
but it is
propped
worth it.
against the register like it had been waiting all night. My mother's handwriting was on the front, not the mother who taught me to fold butter into dough until my arms ached. The mother who gave me away for being a girl. They gave me back like a sweater that didn't fit. And 20 years later, they wanted the receipt. I thought one payment would make her disappear. 40 grand and a signature. But what she actually wanted couldn't fit in a checkbook. And by the time I understood that, she was already sitting in my parents' kitchen. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we sit with the quiet, complicated stories of women who finally learned where the door is and how to close it gently. If a story ever makes you feel a little less alone at your own kitchen table, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I didn't touch the envelope right away. I turned on the ovens first because that is what you do. The bakery smelled like yeast and cold sugar, the way it always does before the sun. I run a place called Kenny's on the corner of 3rd and Maple, and I own it outright, which is a sentence I used to practice saying out loud just to believe it. My name is Adele Kenny. I am 31 years old. My husband Marcus builds furniture in a shop 2 doors down. And most mornings he brings me coffee before either of us has said a word because he knows I don't have words until the first tray is in. Our daughter Nora is 1. She has 8 teeth and a laugh that sounds like a hiccup. And when I hold her, I understand all over again why I never went looking for anybody. My parents, Don and Hank, sold me this bakery for $1 and a promise to keep their sourdough starter alive. They are not my birth parents. They are the ones who stayed. Dawn's heart has been giving her trouble lately. Little flutters, the doctor watches, and Hank pretends not to worry by rearranging the flower bins. I stayed late 3 nights that week because the Hendricks wedding needed 4 tears and nobody else could pipe the roses, right? And because if I am honest, some part of me still believes that if I am useful enough, everyone I love will have a reason to keep me. I wiped down the counter and looked at the envelope again. The color of joy, the wrong handwriting. I told myself I would open it after the roses. I did not open it after the roses. Here is what I know about the people who made me, which is almost nothing. And I built a whole life on that nothing. I was 3 years old when they signed me over. Old enough that I have one memory. Or maybe just the ghost of one. A woman's hands buttoning my coat too fast. A car door. Cold vinyl against my legs. Dawn told me the truth when I was 10 because she believed lies rot a family from the inside. She said my birth parents had wanted a son and could only afford to raise one child well. So, they chose. She did not soften it. She just held my hand while I did the math no child should do. When I was 11, a woman called our house once, asked for me by a name I didn't recognize, and then never called again. Dawn cried in the pantry where she thought I couldn't hear. That was it. That was the entire relationship. 1 button coat and 1 phone call until this envelope. 20 years of a closed door I had stopped checking. I used to imagine when I was younger that they had regretted it, that somewhere a mother was crying too. Then I grew up and stopped imagining because imagining is a bill you pay with your own peace. I taught myself to bake instead. Bread doesn't care whether you were wanted. Bread just needs warmth and time and someone paying attention. And I could give it all 3. I got good enough that people drove from 2 counties over for my croissants. I built a family that chose me back. And then one Tuesday, the color of icing showed up on my counter, and the button coat feeling came back like it had never left. I opened it at 9 after the morning rush in the back room where the mixer drowns out most feelings. The paper was heavy, the kind you buy to seem serious. Her handwriting was neat and looping, the handwriting of a woman who wanted to be seen as gentle. Dearest Ada, it began and my stomach dropped through the floor because nobody has ever called me Ada. That was the name on a certificate I have never held. She wrote that she thought about me every single day. She wrote that God had put me back in her heart. And then 3 paragraphs in, wrapped in so much velvet I almost missed the blade. She asked for $40,000. Not for herself, she was careful to say. For your brother. His name is Bradley and he is 19 and he has such promise and college is so expensive now and family helps family. She underlined family. She signed it your mother Vera as though the word were a fact instead of a thing you earn. I sat on an upturned bucket and read it twice. $40,000 to a woman who once decided I was the affordable one to let go. I noticed my hands were steady. And I noticed because steady hands at a moment like that means something in me had already gone quiet and careful. She wanted money. That part was simple. But she had signed it with a name she gave away when she gave me away. And that told me the money was only the doorway. She wasn't asking me to help her son. She was informing me that the account she'd opened 30 years ago was in her mind still open and she had come to make a withdrawal. My first answer was no. It came up clean and fast before the guilt could get its shoes on. I am not a woman who folds because someone signs a letter. Your mother. I called my friend Priya on my lunch break because Priya is a paralegal and because she tells me the truth even when it costs me a slice of pie. I read her the letter in the alley behind the shop, standing next to the dumpster with my apron still on. She was quiet for a second. Then she said the thing that should have set me free. When an adoption is finalized, Adele, it legally severs the whole relationship. They are not your parents in any way the law recognizes. You owe them exactly nothing. No money, no explanation, no reply. She let that sit. I remember watching a delivery truck idle at the end of the alley and thinking, so that's it. Then it's over. I could throw the letter in the dumpster 3 feet away, and no court, no God, no signature could touch me. Legally, I was a stranger to Vera Kingsley, and strangers don't get $40,000. But Priya knew me, and after a beat, she added the sentence that undid the whole clean feeling. Legally, sure, she said. But you and I both know that's not the account she's trying to collect on. I didn't answer because she was right, and because the account Vera meant had no laws protecting it. Only the soft, stupid, hopeful part of me that had spent 20 years wondering if a mother somewhere cried. That part didn't care what the law said. That part was already reaching for a pen. I wrote her back that night at the kitchen table with Nora asleep and Marcus pretending to read. I kept it short and kind because kindness is the boundary I could actually hold. I told her I was glad she and her son were well. I told her I had a full life and a family and that I would not be sending money and that I wished them the best. I did not sign it. Your daughter. I signed it. Adele. Then I found the number the letter had come from, the one she'd written at the bottom, so I could call to arrange the transfer. And I blocked it. Marcus watched me do it. He is not a man who tells me what to feel. He just put his hand over mine on the table and said, "You don't owe that woman a single thing. And if she comes at you, she comes at both of us." I believed him. I slept that night like the door had closed. I want to be honest about the part I'm not proud of, though, because you came here for honesty. Even as I wrote the refusal, another voice in me was already doing the arithmetic. 40,000 was a lot. It was also for a woman who had clawed her way to owning a building survivable. And if one check made the guilt stop, if one payment let me be the good person, the generous one, the one who rose above, then maybe it was worth it just to be done. I almost wrote that check just to make the guilt stop. If you've ever paid for peace that never came, you already know how this goes. Stay with me. I mailed the refusal instead. And the next afternoon, Dawn's phone rang. Dawn called me at the shop, and her voice had a thin thread in it I hadn't heard since her last cardiologist visit. A woman had phoned the house, she said. A woman she didn't know, asking for Ada. Dawn had said there was no Ada at this number. And the woman had said, "Oh, but there is. She just goes by something else now, doesn't she? And how is the bakery doing?" My hand tightened on the pastry bag until the seam split. Vera had our home number, not my cell, which I could block. The house Dawn and Hank had lived in for 30 years, the number in the old phone book, the one you can find if you know a last name and a town. And she knew about the bakery. I had told her nothing. I had blocked her. And still she was reaching past me, through me, to the people I would burn the whole building down to protect. I kept my voice level for Dawn's sake. Told her not to worry. Told her to hang up if the woman called again. But when I set the phone down, my heart was doing something ugly and fast. Because a stranger who accepts a no goes away. A stranger who circles around behind you to find the softest people in your life is not asking. She is measuring the walls, looking for the window someone left open. I called Marcus. Then I did the thing I do when I'm scared, which is get very organized. I made a list of everyone Vera might reach, and everyone I had to warn. It was a short list, and every name on it was a name I loved. And that was exactly the problem. That evening, I did some looking of my own because I would rather know the shape of a thing than be surprised by it. It didn't take much. Vera hadn't just found the home number. She knew I'd had a baby. She had mentioned Nora's age to Dawn casually. The way you drop a fact to prove you have more of them. She knew the bakery had done well enough to expand. She knew my married name. None of that was public the way she'd have needed 20 years ago. Somebody had been feeding her. And when I laid the timeline out on the kitchen table, the thing that turned my stomach wasn't that she'd found me. It was when the letter had come 6 weeks after Kenny's got written up in the regional paper. A little feature about the local bakery that quadrupled its wedding orders with a photo of me holding a 3-tier cake and grinning like a fool. 20 years of silence. And then the moment I looked solvent, the moment I looked worth it, a letter arrives calling me dearest. I sat with that for a long time because it meant the silence had never been silence. It had been patience. She hadn't forgotten me, and then remembered. She had been watching from a distance, waiting for the girl she gave away to grow into something worth coming back for. I wasn't a daughter she'd lost. I was an investment she'd deferred. The only question left was who had been sending her the reports. Because the article had my name, but not my parents' number, and Vera had walked straight to the softest door in my life, like someone had drawn her a map. Marcus and I argued that night, if you can call it arguing when two tired people love each other and disagree about how to be good. He wanted to lawyer up, send a formal letter, make it cold and final. I understood, but I kept circling back to the same soft place. And I could hear how it sounded even as I said it. If I give her the money once, I said, at least I'm the person who helped. At least I'm not the one who slammed the door. He looked at me for a long moment. Adele, he said, you already got a check ready in your head, didn't you? I hadn't, but I had gotten the pen ready. That was the thing I couldn't explain to him, because it lived under language. When you are given away as a child for not being enough, you spend the rest of your life auditioning to be enough. You overbake. You overgive. You stay late on the Hendrix cake. You keep everyone fed so no one has a reason to hand you back. And here was Vera offering me the one audition I'd wanted my whole life. The chance to prove I was generous, forgiving, worthy, better than the people who'd discarded me. All it cost was $40,000 and the last of my dignity. I actually picked up the pen. Marcus didn't stop me. He just said quietly, whatever you decide, decide it because it's yours, not because it's the bill she thinks you owe. I put the pen down. I didn't write the check that night, but I didn't tear it up in my head either. And Vera, 3 hours away, seemed to know it because 2 days later, the second envelope came. The second envelope was the same cream color. And this time, there was a photograph inside. A boy, 19, standing in front of a brick building with his hands in his pockets. Half a smile, the kind of smile a person gives when someone else told them to smile. Bradley, my brother. The word landed strange in my chest because I'd never had a sibling. And here was a stranger with my birth mother's chin. Vera's note was shorter this time and sharper for it. She wrote that Bradley didn't know she was reaching out, that he was proud and would never ask, but that he was the family's hope, the one who could make something of himself. And wouldn't I want to be part of that? He needs you, she wrote. Your brother needs you. She had learned in the space between letters that a plea for herself bounced off me, so she'd swapped ammunition. She put the boy in front of the money like a shield because she knew the way predators know that I would not fire through a child. And it worked a little. I looked at that half-smile for a long time. But I have piped enough wedding cakes to know the difference between a bride's real joy and the smile she puts on for the photographer's count of 3. And Bradley's smile was the second kind. Then I turned the photo over, because I turn everything over. It's a baker's habit. You always check the bottom. On the back, in different handwriting, was a return address. Not Vera's city, 3 hours away. A house 1 county over from mine. The address of my mother's cousin, my Aunt Marlene. I had met Marlene exactly twice. Both times by accident. Both times through Dawn, who kept a loose thread of contact with my birth family's side the way you keep a spare key you hope never to use. Marlene had always seemed like the neutral one, the aunt who sent a card at Christmas and asked no questions, the border town between 2 countries at war. And her handwriting was on the back of a photograph my birth other had mailed to break my boundary. I sat with the 2 envelopes side by side on the table, the cream, and I felt something in me change gears. Up to that point, I had been reacting, blocking numbers, warning Dawn, arguing with Marcus, playing defense against a woman 3 hours away. But defense loses slowly, and I had a daughter now, and I was done losing slowly. If Vera had a map to my life, I wanted to see who'd drawn it. So, I made a decision that felt at the time like taking a breath before going underwater. I would stop guessing and start finding out. I would call Marlene, not to accuse, just to listen. Because people who think you don't know anything will tell you everything. I picked up the phone before I could talk myself into a softer plan. Marlene answered on the second ring, warm as ever. "Oh, honey, it's been so long.
How's that beautiful baby?"
I asked her gently whether she'd heard from Vera lately.
There was a pause, a small one.
The kind of pause a person takes when the true answer and the safe answer are fighting in their throat. And then Marlene said, "Well, you know how she frets over you. I keep telling her you turned out just fine. I sent her the little update, so she stops worrying." She said it like a kindness. She had just handed me the map, and she thought she was doing me a favor. I kept my voice soft because a soft voice is a fishing line, and I wanted the whole story. "Updates," I said. "What kind of updates?" And Marlene, relieved to be talking, let it all spill. "For years," she said, "since you were a teenager, really, Vera would call and ask how you were doing, and I'd tell her what Dawn told me. When you got into that baking program, when you and Marcus married, when the shop opened, when little Nora was born, she just wanted to know you were happy." Marlene said she never had the nerve to reach out herself. I'm the one who kept saying she should. I listened to a woman describe in the voice of someone recounting a good deed how she had spent a decade as a pipe running my private life to the person I'd been protected from. Every milestone I'd earned, every door I'd built reported back like weather. "She's your mother, Adele," Marlene said when I went quiet. "Blood is blood." And there it was, the whole machine in a single tidy phrase, said by a woman who genuinely believed she was the gentle one. She wasn't cruel. That was almost the worst part. She thought family was a debt that overrode any door you tried to close. That a mother's want automatically outranked a daughter's. No, that the 2 of us were a misunderstanding she could sweetly fix by keeping the information flowing. I thanked her. I didn't yell. Yelling teaches people you're the problem. Instead, I asked her as evenly as I could to please stop sending Vera anything about me or my daughter. There was a silence on the line, hurt and confused. The silence of someone who cannot understand why you'd turn down a favor. "Oh," she said finally. "Well, if that's what you want, but honey," and here her voice dropped, kind and terrible, "you can't really stop your mother.
She's already decided."
Cutting Marlene out cost more than I expected. And I want to be honest about that, too. She wasn't a villain. She was the last thin thread to a whole side of me I'd never gotten to know. The aunt who might have told me stories about grandparents, about where my hands came from, about whether anyone else in that family woke before dawn to bake. When I asked her to stop, I felt the thread snap. And I stood in my kitchen holding a dead phone, a little more alone than I'd been that morning. This is a thing nobody tells you about protecting yourself. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like subtraction. Every wall you build to keep the harmful people out also keeps out the maybe good ones standing behind them. And you don't always get to sort the crowd first. I lost an aunt that afternoon. I gained a locked front door. On paper, it was a fair trade. In my chest, it just acted. Marcus found me still standing there and didn't ask what happened, just started dinner because he's learned that sometimes the kindest thing is to fill the room with the smell of onions and let a person come back to herself. Over the stove, he said one thing. She warned you, didn't she? That Vera has already decided. I nodded. Then decide back, he said, not louder. Just first. It was good advice. I would spend the next several weeks failing to take it because Vera, having lost her pipe, did not slow down. She did what people who see family as property do when the quiet channels close. She stopped writing letters and she got in her car. I drove out to Dawn and Hank's the next Sunday, the little blue house 4 blocks from the bakery, to do the thing I'd been dreading, which was to make my elderly parents afraid on purpose. I sat them down at the same kitchen table where I'd learned to crack eggs one-handed and told them everything, the letters, the money. Marlene, I told them that a woman named Vera might come to their door, and that if she did, they should not let her in, not even to be polite, not even for a minute. Hank got quiet and stern, the way he does when a machine breaks, and he's already fixing it in his head. But Dawn went pale in a way I didn't like, one hand drifting up to her chest, and she said, Adele, honey, is this going to be all right? In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her. I hated Vera in that moment more than I had for any letter, because I was watching a woman with a fragile heart absorb a fear she hadn't earned, and I could see her working to be brave for me, even as her color changed. I got her a glass of water. I stayed too long, and I noticed only later that Dawn had gone unusually quiet when I mentioned that Vera might call the house again. She hadn't said that awful woman the way I expected. She looked down at her hands. At the time, I thought it was fear. I told myself to let it go, that my mother was tired, that I'd frightened her enough for one afternoon. I should have asked what she wasn't saying, but I was so busy building walls that I didn't notice one of them already had a crack. The bakery saved me that week, the way work does. There is no room for a spiraling mind when 40 dozen dinner rolls need to be out by 4. Hank came by to help because he can't stay away from an oven. And we worked the morning shift side by side the way we had when I was 17, and he was teaching me that patience is just love with a timer on it. Around 10 in the lull, he wiped his hands and said the thing I've kept in my apron pocket ever since. You know why we kept you? He said, not looking at me, looking at the proofing dough. It wasn't because you were easy. Lord knows you weren't. It wasn't because you'd amount to anything.
We didn't know that yet.
He turned the dough. You don't get kept for being useful, Adele. You get kept for being ours. I had to go into the back for a minute. I ran the water and told myself it was the flour because that sentence went straight to the wound Vera had reopened. The one that told me every day of my life that I had to earn my place, that love was a bill, and I was always behind on it. Hank had just handed me the opposite arithmetic offhand, wiping his hands like it was obvious. You get kept for being ours. I didn't have the words yet to understand how much I would need that sentence. I just knew it belonged to me now, that Hank had given it to me the way he gave me the bakery, quietly for $1 and a promise. I tucked it away. I would need it at a long table 3 hours from here, sooner than I knew. She came on a Thursday. I know it was Thursday because Thursday is my quiet day, and quiet is what let me see her. I was frosting a batch of lemon cakes near the front window when a car I didn't recognize parked across the street, one of those clean sedans that people buy to look established. A woman got out. She was in her late 50s in a coat too nice for our little downtown. And she stood on the far sidewalk looking at my shop the way you look at a house you used to live in. I knew her before I knew her. The way you recognize your own chin on a stranger.
Vera.
3 hours she had driven 180 m of highway to stand across the street and study the building I'd built. She didn't come in. That was the part that iced my spine. She just looked for a long minute at the gold letters that spell Keeney's on the glass at me behind the counter with a piping bag in my hand, and something moved across her face that I couldn't read and didn't want to. Then she got back in the car and drove away. I stood frozen with the lemon cake half frosted, but she hadn't come for nothing. An hour later, Dawn called, her voice shaking, to tell me a woman had just left an envelope in her mailbox, cream-colored. Not for Dawn, for Ada. Vera had driven 180 miles, looked at the daughter she gave away, decided not to speak to her, and instead delivered her demand to the door of the woman who'd raised her. She wasn't going to ask me. She was going to go around me, and she'd found the one door I couldn't afford to leave unguarded. I caught up with her before she reached the highway because our town is small, and there's only one road out past the feed store. I pulled up beside her sedan at the light and rolled my window down. And for the first time in 28 years, I looked my birth mother in the eye. Up close, she was softer than the coat, tired around the mouth. And when she saw it was me, her whole face rearranged itself into something warm and practiced. "Ada," she breathed like a prayer answered. I said, "My name is Adele, and you need to stop going to my parents' house." She flinched at parents, just slightly, a card player who'd been read. Then she recovered and did the thing she does, the thing I'd only seen on paper until now. She made her voice gentle and laid a hook in every sentence. "I only want what's best for this family," she said. "I gave you a better life than I could offer, Ada. And all I'm asking is that you help your brother the way I made sure you'd be helped. I gave you up so you could rise. Don't you think you owe the family that gave you the chance?" The light turned green. A truck honked behind us. And there in one breath at a traffic light in my own town, Vera had said the whole thesis of her life out loud, comma scripture. She had reframed abandonment as a gift. She had turned giving me away into an investment she was now cashing. I owed her in her mind for the very act of discarding me. I didn't argue. I just said, "That's not how it works," and rolled up my window. But as I pulled away, I caught her last words through the glass. And they were about my daughter. She'd called Nora, her grandchild. "That's my grandbaby, too," she'd said just before my window seal her off. And the words followed me all the way home like a smell you can't wash out. It shouldn't have shaken me. It was just biology, a technicality, the same technicality that let her sign a letter. Your mother. But it did shake me because it revealed the true size of what she wanted. She didn't want $40,000. $40,000 was the opening bid. She wanted back in. She wanted a standing claim on my life, my parents, my daughter, a permanent seat at a table I had built specifically so that people like her could never sit at it. That night, I sat on the nursery floor while Nora slept and let myself feel how tired I was. The specific exhaustion of holding a door shut against someone stronger than the lock. Marcus sat down beside me on the floor, too big for the space, and didn't say anything smart. He just said, "We're okay," over and over until I could breathe. And in the quiet, I felt the old voice make its offer again. So reasonable, so seductive. Just pay her $40,000 and it's over. You can afford it. Be the bigger person. And I was so worn down that I almost decided to do it just to make the whole thing stop, just to be the good one and be done. Then my phone lit up on the nursery floor. It was the bakery's after-hours line, which nobody calls at night. My stomach knew before I answered. It was Hank. His voice was wrong. "Adele," he said, "your mother's in the hospital." I don't remember the drive to the hospital. Only the parking lot, only running. Dawn was in a bed with wires on her chest and an oxygen line under her nose, small in a way I refused to accept. And Hank was in the corner chair looking a decade older than that morning. A cardiac event, the doctor said. Mild. They caught it early. She'd be all right with rest and no stress. And the doctor said the words, "no stress," while looking at a chart, not knowing he'd just prescribed the one thing my family could no longer guarantee. Because when I finally got Hank alone in the hall, he told me what had happened, and I felt something in me go cold and very still. Vera had come to the house. That afternoon after the mailbox she'd knocked, and Dawn, my Dawn, who I'd told 100 times not to open the door, had opened it. Because Dawn is polite, and because Vera had stood on the porch and said the thing that got past every wall. "You've had her 30 years. Vera had said, "I only want a little help for my son. You owe me the daughter you got to keep." She had gone to a woman with a failing heart and told her she was a thief. And Dawn, who had never once made me feel like anything but chosen, had stood in her own doorway and absorbed the accusation that she'd stolen me until her chest seized, and Hank found her gripping the counter. I sat by Dawn's bed all night. Near dawn, she woke, found my hand, and whispered something I will hear for the rest of my life. "Don't let her take you from me. she said, as if I were the one being stolen. In the morning, when the light came gray through the hospital blinds, Dawn asked me to bring her the mail from home. The ordinary mail, bills and coupons, because ordinary is what a scared person reaches for. Hank had grabbed it in his rush out the door, and it was still in his coat. He handed it over, and there, in the middle of the electric bill and a grocery flyer, was the cream envelope, Vera's mailbox delivery, addressed to Ada. It had ridden along by accident, and now it sat on my mother's lap in her hospital gown, this pale rectangle of another woman's demand, and Dawn's hand was resting on top of it, shaking, not from the envelope, just from being 71 and tired and hooked to a monitor. I looked at that, my adoptive mother's trembling hand lying over my birth mother's request for money in a hospital at dawn, and something in me finished changing that had been changing all week. Up until that envelope, I'd been fighting to keep my peace, trying not to be the villain, not to slam the door, hoping there was a version where everyone stayed calm and I paid a fee, and it all went quiet. That version died on the blanket in front of me because I finally understood the shape of the thing I was fighting. Vera would never stop, and she would never come at me directly because she'd learned I was strong. She would come at Dawn, at Hank, at Nora someday. She would keep aiming at the softest people I loved because that was the only leverage that worked on a woman like me, a woman who'd built her whole self on protecting others. I took the envelope off my mother's lap so she wouldn't have to hold it another second. And I made a decision that felt like stepping off a ledge. I was going to drive the 180M to Vera City myself, not to pay to find out what $40,000 was really for, because whatever this was, it wasn't a boy's tuition. And I was done letting her write the story from 3 hours away. When she went after the woman who actually raised me, something in me went quiet and cold. If you've ever gotten calm in the exact moment you should have fallen apart, you'll understand what came next. I waited until Dawn was home and stable. 3 days before I made the drive, Marcus offered to come. I told him to stay with Dawn and Nora because I needed the house guarded more than I needed a passenger, and because some things you have to walk into with your own 2 feet. 180M is 3 hours of highway and a lot of time to talk yourself out of a thing. I didn't. I let the county lines tick past the fields turning to strip malls turning to the gray edge of the city where Vera lived. And I rehearsed nothing because I've learned that a rehearsed woman sounds like a liar. And I wanted to sound like the truth. I had one question and it was simple. What is the money for? Not what she'd written, what it was actually for. Because $40,000 is a specific number, not a round wish. And specific numbers come from bills. And I wanted to see the bill. Her neighborhood was tidy and tired. Small houses with big trucks. The kind of place where everybody knows whose son did what. I found the address from the letter and parked across the street, the same way she'd parked across from my shop. And for a second I understood her a little, the pull to look before you knock. Then I got out, and before I could reach the door, it opened, and a teenager came down the steps carrying a duffel bag, tall and unsure, with a chin I'd have known anywhere because I see it in my own mirror.
He stopped when he saw me.
We stood there, 2 strangers who shared a face on a cracked front walk in a city 3 hours from my life.
Bradley.
He didn't know who I was. I could see it. He looked at me with polite confusion, a well-raised kid meeting a strange woman on his walk. And he said, "Can I help you, ma'am?" And the ma'am nearly undid me because he was my brother, and he was calling me ma'am. I said, my name was Adele. I watched it land as nothing. Then I said, I think Vera is my mother, too. And I watched the color drain out of his young face in real time. He set the duffel down slowly. He said, "You're," and couldn't finish. "I had a sister," he said finally, more to himself than to me, like a fact he was testing. "Mom said, when I was little, she said there was a baby before me, a girl. But she said it didn't work out. It didn't work out." That was the phrase Vera had given him for handing me to a stranger. A baby that didn't work out. Like a recipe, like a business, like a thing you try and abandon. I didn't correct him, standing there on the sidewalk. This boy hadn't discarded me. He'd been a child unborn when the choice was made. And I could already see he was more casualty than culprit. But I needed to understand what I'd driven 3 hours to understand. So I asked him gently whether he was excited about college. He looked at me like I'd spoken another language. College? He said. What college? And the whole cream-colored story Vera had built for $40,000 developed a crack right down the middle because the boy the money was supposedly for had just told me he'd never heard of it. We stood on that sidewalk and I asked him careful questions, the kind you ask when you're afraid the truth is worse than you hoped. No, he said he wasn't enrolled anywhere. No, nobody had asked him about tuition. He'd finished high school in the spring and he'd wanted to do an apprenticeship, welding, or maybe carpentry. He was good with his hands, always had been, but his mother wanted him to go to a real school and make something of himself, and he didn't want to fight her about it. So, mostly, he'd just been working at the auto shop and hoping she'd let it drop. He had no idea a woman 3 hours away was being asked for $40,000 in his name. When I told him careful and quiet that his mother had written to me asking for exactly that for his education, his face did something complicated. He wasn't surprised, not entirely. He was ashamed. The specific shame of a kid who spent his whole life being spent as currency and has just watched it happen again in front of a stranger who shares his chin. Mom does that, he said, so soft I almost missed it.
She tells people things about me.
Then his voice caught, and he looked at the duffel bag at his feet, the one he'd been carrying out the door when I arrived. And I understood that I had walked into the middle of a boy leaving home, and that the two of us, the discarded daughter and the burdened son, were standing on opposite ends of the exact same scale. And then the front door opened again, and Vera stepped out onto the porch and saw us standing there together, and her face fell straight through the floor. For one unguarded second, Vera looked at the two of us on her walk, and I saw pure panic, the look of a woman whose two separate stories have just met each other in the yard. Then the mask slid back on warm and quick. Bradley, honey, she called. Go on and put your bag back inside, and let me talk with our guest. Not Ada, not Adele. Our guest stripping me of even a name in front of him. Bradley looked at me, then at her, then picked up the duffel and went inside, obedient the way I'd never learned to be. And I felt a pang of something almost like envy that curdled fast into grief, because his obedience was a cage, and mine had been in exile, and neither of us had ever gotten to just be a kid. Vera came down the steps and took my elbow like we were friends, steering me toward the door, chattering. Oh, you came all this way.
Come in.
Let me make coffee. You should have called. I let her steer me because I wanted inside that house, wanted to see the bills, wanted to stand in the room where the $40,000 had a real reason. She sat me at her kitchen table, all hospitality, and turned to fill a kettle. And while her back was to me, I let my eyes go where a baker's eyes always go, to the surfaces, to the counters, to the papers pushed to the edge of the table, where you shove the things you don't want a guest to see. There was a stack there, envelopes with plastic windows, the kind of mail that means someone owes someone. And the top one I could read from where I sat was not a college. Vera stepped out to take a phone call. One of those calls she made a show of not wanting to take. So, sorry, just a minute. Family business. And the second the screen door clapped shut, Bradley slipped back into the kitchen like he'd been waiting for the gap. He sat down across from me, this boy with my chin, and he talked fast and low, the way you talk when a door might open any second. He wanted to tell me the truth, he said, because nobody ever asked him for it. He didn't want college. He'd said it a dozen ways, and she never heard it. What he wanted was the welding program at the technical college 2 towns over, 9 months, hands-on, a real trade, a real paycheck. At the end, he had the brochure hidden in his room. He'd figured out the cost himself, saved part of it at the auto shop, and it was a fraction of $40,000. A small, honest number for a small, honest dream. But every time he brought it up, his mother would get that look, he said. That disappointed look like he was choosing to be less than the family needed, and she'd start talking about the sister who threw away her chances. Meaning me, meaning the cautionary tale I'd become without ever being in the room. So I'm the warning, I said, and he winced. Yeah, kind of sorry. I told him not to be sorry. I looked at this kid across the table, and I finally saw the whole machine clearly, the one Marlene had named without understanding. Vera had 2 children. She'd discarded one for being a girl and was crushing the other for being the boy she'd staked everything on. Different weapons, same scale. I'd spent my life thinking I was the one who got thrown away. Sitting in that kitchen, I realized Bradley was being thrown away, too, just slower in a nicer house. With a smile, the photographer counted to 3-4. We didn't have long, and we both knew it. So, we did the thing siblings do in 9 minutes. What should take 9 years. Bradley told me he'd always felt watched but never seen. I told him I'd always felt seen but never wanted. He laughed a short surprised sound and said we got opposite halves of the same lousy deal.
Huh?
Yeah, I said we did. And in that small ugly kitchen over a kettle that hadn't boiled, I felt the last of my self-pity leak out of me. Because for 28 years, I had carried the story that I was the family reject, the one who wasn't good enough. And it turned out that wasn't the shape of it at all. The truth was uglier and cleaner both. Vera hadn't rejected me for lacking value. She'd been blind to value that didn't fit her plan. She threw away a daughter and shackled a son with the same hand, the same rule, the same old arithmetic that said a child is worth what a child can do for the family name. I wasn't the failed one, and Bradley wasn't the favored one. We were both just line items in a ledger that had nothing to do with either of us. He asked me, hesitant, what I was going to do about the money. And I realized I didn't fully know yet, only that whatever I did, it could not be the simple check I'd been carrying in my head for 2 weeks, because that check wouldn't save Bradley. It would fund the machine. Down the hall, the screen door creaked. Ver's call was ending. Quick, I said before she comes back in. Where does she keep the bills? He pointed at the stack by my elbow. The one I'd already seen. Look at the top one, he whispered. It's not for me. I looked at the top one. I had maybe 10 seconds. And 10 seconds is enough when you already know what you're looking for. It was not a tuition statement. It was a past due notice, the amount circled in the same neat looping hand that had written Dearest Ada, and under it, half-tucked, more of them. A second notice on a personal loan in Vera and Curtis's names, a collections letter, and at the very bottom of the little stack, something that made the whole thing click into a shape I hadn't expected. A wedding, not Bradley's, a cousin's wedding months back, and a note in Vera's hand about money owed to relatives, gift money she'd apparently promised in front of the whole family and then couldn't cover. A debt of face as much as cash. I sat back just as the screen door announced a return. But I had it now. The $40,000 was never a boy's education. It was Vera's debts, her loans, her collections, and threaded through all of it, the money she'd promised the family to keep up appearances and couldn't pay. She hadn't come to me for Bradley's future. She'd come to me for her own reputation, for the standing in the family that she'd spent beyond. And she'd wrapped it in a boy's name, because she knew I would never fire through a child. Bradley was the shield, the debt was the wound, and I was the deep pocket she'd been patiently watching ripen for 20 years, ever since she looked at a 3-year-old and decided which child would cost less to keep. Vera came back into the kitchen smiling, kettle finally screaming behind her, and asked, bright as anything, so have you thought about how you'd like to send it? Here is the part one have to tell carefully, because it's the moment the ground gave out under me. Right up until Vera asked how I'd like to send it. I had been holding in the back pocket of my mind a compromise that felt almost noble. I'd stop calling it hers. I'd send the $40,000 and tell myself it was for Bradley, a gift from a sister to a brother laundered clean of Vera's grip just by intention. I could rise above the whole ugly business, help the kid, be the generous one, and go home to my daughter feeling like the good person I'd auditioned to be my entire life. That plan had survived the hospital and the drive and the sidewalk. It died at that kitchen table with the bills 6 in from my hand because I finally understood that there was no clean way to give her money. There was no version of $40,000 that reached Bradley. Every dollar I sent would go to the past due notice, the collections letter, the wedding debt, the reputation Vera was drowning to maintain, the exact machine that had discarded me and was now crushing my brother. If I paid, I wouldn't be rising above the Sunfirst ledger my family lived by. I'd be balancing its books. I'd be teaching Vera that the daughter she threw away was in the end worth exactly what she'd bet, a return on an investment, cashing out on schedule, and I'd be teaching Bradley that his sister, the one person who might have seen him, had shown up and funded his cage. The check in my head tore itself up. I felt it go. It was terrifying because that check had been my whole strategy for 2 weeks. the escape hatch, the way to make it stop. And it turned out to be a door that only opened deeper into her house. So Vera said again, patient, gentle, poisonous. How would you like to send it, dear? I looked at her over the screaming kettle. I said, I need to think. And I stood up to leave because I had just realized that giving her anything in any form with any story attached would make me a partner in the very thing that had broken me. There was no paying my way out. There was only cutting the wire. Vera didn't like, I need to think. Her face slipped just for a second, the warmth curdling into something older and harder. And in that second she stopped performing and told me the truth, which is the only useful thing she ever gave me. You think, she said. You think about everything, don't you? Always the careful one. Then low almost to herself. You owe me, Ada. I carried you. I gave you to people who could do better, because I loved you enough to lose you. Do you know what that costs a mother? The least you can do is not let this family drown. I stood by her door with my keys in my hand and looked at her. This woman who had just described abandoning her child as an act of love so profound it had earned interest for 30 years. She believed it. That was the thing that finally cooled all the heat out of me. She wasn't lying to manipulate me. Not exactly. She had told herself this story so many times. It had become her bones. In her ledger, giving me up was a sacrifice, and a sacrifice creates a debt. And the debt was mine to pay, because I was the one who'd gotten the better life she'd generously arranged. There was no arguing with it, because it wasn't an argument. It was a religion. And then she said the thing that told me how far she'd already gone. I told the family you'd help. She said at the reunion, I told them my daughter did well, and she'd take care of things. So you see you have to, because if you don't, well, they'll all know what kind of person you turned out to be. She had spent my name before she ever asked. And now she meant to collect in public. The family dinner was that Sunday. She informed me as if I'd already agreed to attend. A reunion, she called it. The whole extended clan at her house, aunts and cousins and Marlene and Curtis and the wedding people she owed, all gathered to eat. And though she didn't say it this way, to witness, she had built a room. That's what I understood. Standing at her door, with the kettle finally quiet behind us. She was assembling an audience because a private no she could survive. But a daughter who refused her mother in front of the whole family, who let the family drown when she could have saved it. That daughter would be branded, and the shame would do the collecting that her letters couldn't. It was elegant in an awful way. She'd learned I wouldn't fold to guilt. So she was building a courtroom where the jury was everyone whose opinion she'd trained me from a distance through Marlene to imagine caring about. You'll come, she said. It wasn't a question. And then the line that made the whole trap snap shut, delivered soft, almost tender. Because if you don't come, Ada, I'll simply have to tell them the story myself. My version of how the daughter I sacrificed everything for grew up cold and turned her back on the family that gave her the chance. She smiled. And you're a businesswoman now. You know how much a reputation is worth. I drove home 3 hours in the dark, and I did not fall apart. Though there was a version of that night where I would have. Instead, something in me got very clear and very level. The way the kitchen gets at 4 in the morning before anyone else is awake. She'd built a room. Fine. I would decide what happened in it. I got home near midnight. Marcus was up, of course, sitting at the kitchen table with the light on like a lighthouse and Nora asleep upstairs and Dawn's condition steady. He told me first, knowing that's the sentence I needed before any other. Then he looked at my face and said, You're going to go, aren't you, to the reunion? I said, Yes. He didn't like it. He said, You don't have to walk into a room she built to trap you, Adele. You don't owe her an appearance any more than you owe her money. And he was right about her. But I'd stopped somewhere on the dark highway being about her at all. Here's where I stopped asking how to help her and started asking who the money was really for. Comment if you saw it coming. I'm not going for Vera, I told Marcus. I'm going for Bradley, because there was a boy in that house with a welding brochure hidden in his room and a mother turning him into a bill. And I was the only person alive who understood both ends of his particular trap, having lived the other end of it. If I stayed home and mailed a cold lawyer's letter, I'd protect myself and leave him in there alone. One more sibling I let the family sacrifice. I could not, and still be someone I could stand to be. But I wasn't going to walk into her courtroom to be judged either. I was going to walk in with a plan, a real one built cold at my own kitchen table with the two people I trusted most. So the next morning, before the ovens were even warm, I called Priya, and I called someone else, and I started to build the only thing that could beat a woman who saw children as currency, which was a way to give without her ever getting to spend it. Priya connected me with a woman who set up education trusts, the kind of careful, boring legal instrument nobody thinks about until it saves them. We sat in a small office, and I explained what I wanted, and I watched the trust attorney's face go from routine to interested as she understood the shape of the problem. I wanted to put money aside for Bradley, real money, enough for his welding program, and then some, more than the small number he'd calculated for himself, enough to launch a life. But I wanted it locked, held by a third party, released only for verified educational or vocational costs for tools for tuition for the trade he actually wanted. Not a dollar of it reachable by anyone else, not payable to a parent, not divertible to a debt, not a resource Vera could borrow against or pressure him to hand over. It could only ever become the thing it was for. The attorney nodded slowly and said it was very doable. She would draw up the full trust documentation, name an independent trustee, and write the terms so the money released only against verified invoices from the school or the tool supplier paid straight to them, never as cash into anyone's hand. And then she said, the one condition that mattered for it to be clean, the beneficiary has to want it. Bradley would have to agree knowingly, and it would be best if Vera didn't know the mechanism until it was already done, because a person like the one I was describing would spend the days between finding a crack. I understood. My weapon wasn't going to be louder than Vera's or crueler or more manipulative. I wasn't going to out her or shame her back or prove I was the real victim. I was going to do the one thing her entire worldview had no defense against. I was going to give my brother something she could never turn into money, something that helped him and could not by its very design ever help her. I left the office with papers in a folder and for the first time in weeks, the specific calm of a person who has stopped bracing and started building. Reaching Bradley, without Vera hearing took some doing. He'd slipped me his number on that sidewalk, folded small like contraband, and I texted him from the shop one afternoon and asked if he could talk somewhere his mother wasn't. He called me from the auto shop on his break, engine noise behind him. And I told him the truth plainly, the way Dawn once told me the truth, because I've learned that's the only kind of respect that lasts. I told him the money his mother wanted was for her debts, not his future. And I watched, even over a bad phone line, the way that news both hurt him and freed him. The confirmation of a thing he'd half known his whole life. Then I told him what I wanted to do instead. Money set aside just for him, for the welding program, locked so no one could touch it but him, and only for the trade he actually wanted. He was quiet for a long time. The engine noise filled the line. And then in a voice younger than 19, he said the thing that told me I was doing the right thing no matter what it cost. Nobody's ever asked me what I wanted before. He said, "You're the first person who asked me what I wanted." I had to lean on the walk-in door to stay standing because that was my whole life he'd just described from the other side. 2 kids, one thrown out and one held too tight. And neither of us had ever been asked. I told him I'd see him Sunday. I told him not to say a word to Vera. And I told him because someone should have told both of us decades ago that what he wanted mattered, that it had always mattered, that the wanting was allowed. The night before the reunion, I stopped by the little blue house. Dawn was up and moving, slow but herself, banished from the kitchen by Hank and hating it. And she made me sit while she fussed over whether I was eating. I told her where I was going the next day, and I braced for her to be afraid again. But my mother surprised me. She took my hand across the table, the same table, and she didn't tell me to be careful. She told me to remember something. "You spent your whole life, honey, thinking you had to earn your way in here," she said. I watched it, staying late, fixing everything, feeding everybody. She squeezed my hand. "But you didn't earn us. You don't earn family. You don't get kept for being useful, Adele. You get kept for being ours." Hank's sentence in Dawn's voice handed to me a second time, like they'd agreed I'd need it twice. And I understood they had. That the two of them in their quiet way had been trying for 20 years to teach me the lesson Vera had spent my childhood teaching me the opposite of. I asked Dawn how she knew I needed to hear it right then. She smiled, tired and knowing. Because tomorrow that woman is going to tell you your worth is what you can pay, she said. And I need you to already know she's wrong before you walk in the door. I drove home with a sentence tucked in my chest like a stone I could hold. Whatever Vera had built in that house, whatever audience, whatever trap, I would walk in already knowing the one thing that made all of it powerless. You get kept for being ours, not for what you're worth for being. Someday I drove the 180M one more time in my good coat with a cream envelope in my bag. Not a check, something else. I'd chosen the color on purpose, the exact shade Vera had used, the exact shade of wedding icing because I wanted her to see the envelope and think she'd won, right up until the second she opened it. Petty, maybe. But I'd earned one small pettiness after 28 years. And this one had a point. The house was full when I got there. Cars up and down the block, the windows warm and yellow. I sat outside for a minute the way both of us apparently do, and I made myself breathe, and I touched the envelope in my bag once like a talisman. Inside were the trust papers already drawn, already signed by me, needing only Bradley's yes to lock forever. My weapon was a legal instrument, so boring it could put a room to sleep. But it was the only weapon that fit the crime because it gave without her getting, helped without her healing, and there was no manipulation in the world that could reach past a document that simply structurally would not release funds to anyone but the boy she'd been using as bait. I got out of the car. I walked up the steps I'd watched Bradley walk down carrying a duffel bag 2 weeks before. And when Vera opened the door, her face bloomed with triumph. Because I had come to the room she'd built. And to her, that could only mean I'd folded. Ada, she said, warm and loud enough for the hall behind her to hear. You made it.
Come in.
Everyone's dying to meet you. I stepped inside into a front room full of strangers who shared my blood. All of them turning to look at the daughter who'd been given away and grew up rich. And I understood I had walked willingly into her courtroom. What she didn't understand was that I'd brought my own verdict. The dinner was a performance, and I was the guest of honor in a play I hadn't read. Vera seated me in the middle of the long table where everyone could see me. And she played the reunited mother to the rafters, touching my arm, calling me Ada in front of the aunts, telling a cousin how proud she was, how well her girl had done, as if she'd raised me herself, as if she hadn't handed me off at 3. And I watched the small things, because the small things are where the truth lives. When the food came around, she served Bradley first, keeping his plate before anyone else's, before Curtis, before the elders, an old reflex older than either of her children. The son fed first, always the boy who mattered getting the choicest piece. Nobody at that table thought it was strange. That was the part that chilled me, sitting there with my hands in my lap. Not one of these warm, ordinary people, passing rolls and asking about my bakery, saw anything odd in a mother who'd thrown away a daughter and now beamed at her. In a boy fed first out of a habit, no one questioned. This was just how their world worked. Vera wasn't a monster to them. She was Aunt Vera, who'd had a hard time, whose girl went to a better home, whose boy was going to make something of himself. The whole terrible arithmetic of my life was just to this room the ordinary math of family. I ate 3 bites I didn't taste. I answered questions about croissants. And I waited because you don't overturn a table before the food's been served, and because Vera had built this room to corner me in front of witnesses. And I intended to let her right up until the moment I turned the room into something she hadn't planned. It was an old great-aunt who cracked the door on Vera without meaning to, the way old women do, saying the quiet things over dessert because they've outlived the fear of consequences. She patted my hand and said, "You know, your mother had it hard too, dear, when she was young." And then to the table, warming to the memory, she told it. How Viva Vera had grown up the only girl among brothers in a house where the boys got the schooling and the girl got the chores. How Vivera's own mother had told her plainly that a daughter's whole job was to marry well and give her husband sons, that a woman who couldn't produce a boy was a field that wouldn't take seed. How Vera had 2 daughters first and the second, the great-aunt said, not knowing she was talking about me. Well, times were hard, and a girl was a mouth, and a son was the future, and Vera did what she thought she had to. The table murmured, sympathetic, and I sat very still because I was watching the whole ugly machine reveal its own gears. Vera hadn't invented the rule that discarded me. She'd been raised inside it. She'd been the unwanted girl once, told her value was in the sons she could produce, and she'd swallowed that poison so young it became the water she swam in. And when she'd found herself with a daughter she couldn't afford and a chance at a son, she'd made the only choice her whole world had ever offered her. I understood her in that moment more than I ever wanted to. She was not the author of the cruelty. She was its longest-serving employee. I even felt it, the traitor pull of sympathy, the wish that I could reach across the years to the girl she'd been. But understanding is not absolution, and a victim who becomes an enforcer is still an enforcer, and the boy at the end of the table was still being fed first, while his real life sat in a folder in my bag. Vera let the sympathy settle, and then she made her move, because she'd waited all night for a full and softened room. She stood, wine glass in hand, and tapped it, and the table hushed the way tables do. She talked about family, about sacrifice, about how blessed she was to have all of us together. And then she turned to me, and her voice took on the wet warmth of a woman about to spend her daughter in public. As many of you know, she said, my Ada was raised elsewhere, and she's done so well. So well, and she has generously agreed to help this family in our time of need, especially her brother. She reached over and squeezed Bradley's shoulder. He went stiff as a post. Isn't that right, dear? She said to me, in front of the aunts, the cousins, the wedding people she owed, the great aunt who just told my origin story as tragedy. She had built the whole evening to this. A room full of witnesses, a public assumption of my yes, so that a no would land not as a boundary, but as a betrayal. A cold, rich Ada turning her back on family. Every face turned to me, kind and expectant, waiting for the grateful daughter to confirm her generosity. And I felt the trap close. Felt exactly how it was designed to work. The shame of disappointing a whole table engineered to override the truth of a single wrong. It was I'll give her this. A beautiful piece of machinery. I set down my fork. I stood up and I reached into my bag for the cream envelope, and I watched Vera's face flood with victory, because to her, a woman reaching for an envelope at that table could only mean one thing. I didn't raise my voice. I've learned that the person who stays quiet in a loud room becomes the only thing anyone can hear. I said, thank you. And I meant it as a closing, not an opening, the way you thank a jury before the verdict. I said I wanted to be honest with everyone since we were all family. And then, level as a countertop, I told them what the money was actually for. Not Bradley's education, I said. There is no college. Bradley never enrolled anywhere. He'd like to learn a trade, and no one in this house has ever asked him. The $40,000 was for past due loans and collections. And I looked at the wedding cousins, the gift money that was promised and never paid. I laid it out plain, no heat in it, just the facts a baker keeps. And I watched the warm room go cold in stages, faces turning from me to Vera and back, the murmur draining out of them. Vera's mask didn't slip, so much as shatter. You ungrateful, she started, her voice climbing after everything I gave up for you. And there it was, the accusation she'd been saving, the one that had ruled me my whole life. Ungrateful. The word that says you owe, that says a gift was given and never repaid, that says your existence is a debt. 2 weeks earlier, it would have flattened me. But I had a sentence in my chest now, given to me twice, and I stood in that loud collapsing room in front of every witness she'd assembled to shame me. And I did not flinch because I already knew the one thing that made her whole religion powerless. She had gathered a courtroom. I was about to give it a truth she couldn't spend. I opened the cream envelope in front of everyone, and I did not pull out a check. I pulled out the trust papers, and I set them on the table where the light could catch them, and I explained what they were in the plain, slow voice you use for something that matters. This is money set aside for Bradley. I said enough for the welding program he actually wants, and then some. Enough to start a life. It is held by a trust managed by someone who is not in this family, and it can only ever be released for his education and his tools and his training. Not for debts, not for gifts, not for anyone's reputation. I looked at Vera. It cannot be given to you, I said, or borrowed against or spent on anything but him ever. It is his, and only for the thing he chose. The room was dead silent. Bradley was staring at the papers like they were a language he'd waited his whole life to learn to read. And Vera, who had built an entire evening to corner me into writing her a check, understood in real time that I had brought a gift she could not touch, a generosity engineered specifically to root around her, and that in front of her whole assembled family, I had just made her a witness instead of a collector. She opened her mouth. I don't need you to sign anything, I told her before she could find the angle. Only Bradley does. This was never yours to say yes to. And I slid the papers gently down the long table, past the aunts and the cousins and the wedding people to the boy at the end who'd been fed first and seen never. And I said, "It's yours, Bradley, if you want it. Nobody else gets a vote." Vera stood up, so fast her chair went over, and the mask was gone completely now. The warm, reunited mother burned off to show the thing underneath, and she was loud in the way she'd built the whole room to make me be, except it was her, not me, coming apart in front of the family. "You can't do this," she said. "You can't just walk in here, and after everything, after what I gave up, I gave you a better life. I sacrificed my own child, so you could have more. You owe this family. You owe me." And the whole table watched her say it, watched a mother stand in her own dining room and demand payment for having given her daughter away. And I did the only thing that could end it, which was not to match her volume, but to answer her. Finally, with the truth, I'd driven 360 miles round trip and 28 years to say. I stayed in my chair. I kept my hand still on the table, and I said, "You didn't give me away, Vera. You gave me back. There's a difference, and I finally know it," she said, "after everything I gave up for you." And I said, "You gave me up. That's the only thing you gave." The room did not gasp. It went stiller. The stillness of people watching a wall they'd always leaned on turn out to be a curtain. Then I stood, because I'd said the thing. And I told her the part that cost me. Because the truth is, I did lose something at that table. And I want you to know I felt it. "I will not give you $1. I said. "Not now, not ever. And this is the last time you'll see me. I have a family. You are not in it. Every child at that table who's watching." And I meant Bradley. I meant the cousins. I meant the next girl born into this arithmetic deserves to know their worth was never the question. I did not raise my voice on any of it. Vera's shaking, her tears, her cry of ungrateful child thrown at my back. Those did the shaking for both of us. I had walked into her courtroom to be judged, and I had, in the end, quietly dismissed the case. Then Bradley did the bravest thing I saw all night, braver than anything I'd done, because I'd had 28 years and a family and a paid-off building to make me strong. And he had none of that. Only 19 years inside her house. He picked up the trust papers. He stood the chair scraping, and in the silence he looked at his mother, and then at me, and he said in a voice that cracked and held anyway, "I want the welding program. That's what I want. That's what I've always wanted." He was shaking, but he held the papers. And then quieter to Vera, he said, "She asked me, Mom. Adele asked me what I wanted. You never did." It was the first time, I think, that anyone in that room had chosen me. The discarded one over her. And it was the son doing it, the favored one, the one she'd staked everything on, stepping off the scale she'd built. Vera looked at Bradley like the floor had opened. Because losing me had cost her nothing she valued. She'd bet on the boy. But the boy was standing up, holding a folder, choosing the sister over the mother, choosing his own small, honest dream over her whole ledger, and that she had not planned for. I put my hand on Bradley's shoulder just once, the way Hank puts his on mine. Some of the aunts were crying. Marlene wouldn't look at me. Curtis, who hadn't said a word all night, was staring at his plate with an expression I couldn't name and didn't have time to. Bradley and I stood together at the end of a long table full of family, holding a piece of paper that couldn't be bought. And for the first time in either of our lives, the arithmetic of that house did not add up in her favor. I didn't stay to be forgiven or fought. There was nothing left in that room for me, and everything I'd come to do was done. I set my own cream envelope down on the table, Empty now, its work finished. And I told Bradley the trust attorney would call him that week and to call me whenever, day or night, and that he had a family now, too, if he wanted one, 3 hours away, that smelled like bread. Then I said goodbye to him. Only to him. And I walked out through the front room full of people who shared my blood and did not share my life. Past the coats and the casserole dishes and out the door. Down the steps Bradley had carried his duffel down and into the cold, clean evening. I did not look back at the house. I had spent 28 years looking back at that house, wondering if a light was on for me. And now I knew there had never been a light, only a ledger. And I was finally permanently closing the book. My hands were steady on the car keys. I noticed that the whole drive up I'd braced for how bad it would feel to be called ungrateful in front of a room. To lose the fantasy family for good, to cut the last thread. And it did hurt. A real and specific grief. The death of a hope I'd carried since I was 3 years old in a too-fast coat. But under the grief was something I hadn't felt in the presence of those people ever in my life.
Air.
The specific air of a door closed gently and for good. I got in the car. I put my hands on the wheel. And for the first time driving away from that house, I wasn't leaving anything behind. I was only going home. Marcus had the porch light on when I pulled in near midnight. And Nora was asleep. And the house smelled like the soup he makes when he's worried. And I stood in my own doorway for a second just to feel the difference between this threshold and the one I'd left. He didn't ask how it went. He looked at my face and knew the way he always does, and he just held me in the kitchen for a long time while the soup went cold on the stove. Later I told him all of it. The great aunt, the trust, Bradley standing up, the word ungrateful thrown at my back. And Marcus, who is not a man of speeches, said only, "So you did it. You gave the kid a life, and gave her nothing." I said, "Yeah, and I found out I'm not the one who was thrown away. I'm just the one who got out." That's the thing I carried home from that table more than any victory. Not that I'd won, because you don't win against a whole way of seeing the world. Vera drove back to her debt, still believing exactly what she'd always believed. But I had reached back into that machine and pulled one person free and closed the door on the rest and come home to the family that kept me for no reason at all except that I was theirs. The weeks after that dinner emptied out slowly, the way late summer does, and by the time the leaves along my street started to turn, I could breathe all the way to the bottom of my lungs again. Bradley started the welding program that fall.
He texts me pictures of his work.
Sparks and steel, and a grin that reaches his eyes now. The real kind. No photographer counting to 3. He doesn't go through Vera. He goes straight to me, a brother to a sister. The two ends of the scale finally talking to each other, without her hand on the balance. He came to the bakery once, 3 hours in his own car, and Hank taught him to make a bowl, and the sight of the two of them flouring a counter is a thing I keep in the same pocket as Hank's sentence. Vera never wrote again. I hear through the thinned-out grapevine that she still tells the family her version, that her ungrateful daughter turned cold and rich and abandoned them, and that some of them believe her, and I have made my peace with that. The machine that discarded me still runs. I didn't dismantle it. I just stopped feeding it and I pulled my brother out of its gears, and I made sure the account she opened when I was 3 would stay closed forever. Some debts you don't pay. Some debts were never yours. Nearly a year has gone by since that table, one whole turn of the seasons, and Nora is 2 now, and she stands on a stool at my elbow in the mornings with flour on her nose, patting dough with serious little hands, and she has no idea she is the whole point. I used to think they gave me back like a sweater that didn't fit. But you can't return a person. I just didn't know that yet. At 3 in the cold car, Nora will never know that arithmetic. She will grow up in a house where nobody is fed first, where love is not a bill, where she is kept every single day for no reason at all except that she is ours. That's the wall I built in the end. Not the one that keeps Vera out, though it does. The one that keeps Nora in unconditionally before she ever has to earn a thing. She'll never audition for her place at this table. She was born holding it. And on the morning she falls asleep in the flour bin, I look at her and I understand finally and completely that I was always worth keeping. I just had to be the one to decide it. I spent my whole life trying to be useful enough to keep. And it turns out the people who actually love you never once do the math.
A cream envelope, a borrowed name, a table full of people waiting for me to fold. I didn't. If you've ever had to decide that love should never cost your whole self, that some doors are meant to close gently and stay closed, then this table was set for you, too. Tell me in the comments about the door you finally closed and subscribe to Calm Drama Stories, and I'll keep a seat warm and the ovens on for you.